Greetings everyone, in today's video we're diving into the twisted and terrifying Black Grail from the Trench Crusade. I'll be showing you some of my favourite, easiest and most effective methods for painting realistic Grimdark flesh. I'll also be sharing a new technique I've recently found and started experimenting with, one that's full of potential and due to its unique properties work perfect for the Grimdark style. Stay tuned to learn how to create lifelike corrupted flesh with varied surface finishes and discover techniques you can apply to any of your Grimdark projects. I'm Nate the Feral Painter and welcome to the Grimdark Compendium. So when it comes to 3D printed miniatures, and before we've even started to apply any primers or anything like that, there's a few things that we need to take into consideration when working with resin. First of all, you'll notice that mine's this like red wax colour. Don't worry about that, that's not essential to the actual project or anything like that. This is just the resin that I use. Yours may be a different colour, but there's a few things that we need to do before we can start applying any primers or texturing to these miniatures. Now you will notice you may get these little nubs when you look around the miniature, and these are just from the support, so make sure that you are cleaning them up and sanding them down. Sometimes with these you can get away with them a little bit, and I purposely left a few of those little nubs in, and these just add some additional boils or texture to the skin. Also, it's a good idea to clean these with isopropyl alcohol just to make sure that there's no debris or any contaminants around the miniature that can affect our paint job. On some of your miniatures you may get some gaps depending on how you've printed yours, and these can easily be filled in with something like green stuff or two-part epoxy resin, but it's just a good idea just to go through and make sure that there's no gaps in and around your miniature. And if you're not a great sculptist like me, especially with the lower half of some of the miniatures that it didn't quite fit together, but you can get away with the sculpting being a little bit rough, again because it plays into that plague and distress of the skin. Next up, we're going to add some texture to our miniatures, and we're going to do this in a couple of different ways, just using two products. Firstly, we're going to grab some liquid green stuff. Anything like Vallejo putty or Tamiya basic putty will also work for this process. And then secondly, we're going to come in with a little bit of typhus corrosion. Now, when adding textures to miniatures, it's always a good idea to keep in mind the actual scale of the miniatures. Too big, say if you're using texture paste or something like that, it can be quite large. Even the typhus corrosion, is the little granular effects that you get inside it, is still quite large for these types of miniatures, but it's the smallest that we can kind of get hold of, so we can work with that. And I'm only going to use the typhus corrosion on some of the metal or more rusted areas. What we'll be doing a bit later on to get some more texture onto the miniature is using actual paints and enamels themselves to help us create that in-scale texture. Now for the cloth, I'm going to come in with liquid green stuff. This is a great product that is water soluble and you can thin it down with water. And I'm just coming in with an old brush and just stippling this onto some of the cloth areas. So if any of your miniatures have got any cloth or clothing, this is where I'm going to apply some of that texture. And it's just a case of once it starts to dry, just come back in with your brush once some of that liquid green stuff has started to come off, and start to attack it again in a stippling motion, and this will just rough up that texture a little bit more. You can add another layer of this if you want a little bit more corrosion, but just take in mind the scale that we've previously spoken about. After all that has had ample time to dry, we can then come in and start to prime our miniatures, and for this I've used Stynylrez Grey Primer. Once that has completed, I'm going to load up some AK deck tan into my airbrush, and then from above in a 45-degree angle, aiming downwards in a zenithal highlight, apply the deck tan to the miniature. I'm not too worried about hitting any armor sections. This is just going to be applied to the skin areas, and because we've applied that lighter colour atop of the grey in a zenithal, this will leave some of that grey showing through in the shadow sections, and this will just help distinguish some of that highlight and shadow on the creature's skin. Now, the next portion of this tutorial, I'm going to be focusing on filters. And the reason I'm using filters, because we've got that really light tone above for the skin, we can now come in with transparent filters. And these can be anything from speed paints to contrast paints to even washes themselves. So what I've done for this, and you can get a little bit creative at this time if you want in a different look to your miniature, and feel free to use any colours of your choice that are sort of in the flesh tone. If you want to go for more a green one, you could use a green corrupted flesh, or if you want something a little bit cooler, you could use something like Colia green shade. But for me, I've loaded up the contrast paint Dark Oath Flesh. And as we did when we applied the zenithal highlight, we're going to do the exact same thing but from the opposite way. So we're going to tilt our miniature back a little bit so we're shooting up into those shadows, and this is just going to catch those shadow areas and add a slight filter to the skin whilst retaining that deck tan highlights that we've just added. But I didn't just end the filtering there. I then loaded up some more saw colours. I wanted to create some filters around some of these saw and pustule areas, and for this I've used Citadel's Berserker Bloodshade. I've lowered my airbrush pressure down to around 15 psi, and you can do this with either a 0.4 needle and nozzle. You don't need a really tight needle, or if you've got a 0.2 you can do that as well. And it's just a case of coming in a little bit closer to your miniature and very gently applying some of those filters to those areas. So the final stage of filtering that we're going to add to our miniature's skin is some speckling, and this is just going to create some mottling that as we get further into this tutorial, this will just help create that mottling that sits underneath the skin, and these will appear as like more boils or just some infected flesh. And that's the nice thing about the Black Grail, because of their infected nature, we can take things a little bit further and a little bit more extreme. But these little speckles and filters are going to be sat underneath the skin, so that when we rotate the miniature around, or if someone looks at it a little bit later on, it's going to have a ton of variation, mottling and colours. Now I have used some alternative colours for this, like I've just used the more reddish and warm tones. For these speckles I'm going to switch it up to more of a cold tone, so this can be something like some purple, some blues, or even some greens into your miniature. And I tend to do a couple of different passes of different colours, varied the speckle sizes around the miniature. Don't go overboard, you don't want a dotted miniature, where again, depending on where you're aiming it, you can get as much or as less as you like at this filter stage. Moving on to base coating the rest of the miniature out now at this stage, and first of all I'm going to tackle the armor plates, and I wanted a really corroded look for this. You know, I'm presuming that these guys are not really going to be looking after their armor too much. As you can tell from the sculpts, a lot of their armor is absolutely knackered and it's all beaten up, it's got corrupted holes in it and everything like that. So first of all, I'm going to base coat all the armor sections out in Scale 75's Decayed Metal, followed up by a dry brush of Runlord Brass from Citadel. And doing this dry brush will just help catch those raised edges and also highlights the armor, picking out those details. The silver metallic areas were just given a base coat of Iron Warriors. I've not added any highlights to these, as we'll be turning these into more of a rust tone a little bit later on in the video. The skulls were given a base coat of Two Thin Coat's Dragon Fang, and then given a stippled highlight of Two Thin Coat's Vampire Fang. Now the reason I'm doing it in a stippled one is again to add to that corroded look, and I think it's just a really nice, quick and easy way to highlight your miniatures while still retaining some mottling. And finally, all the cloth areas were given a base coat of AK Smoke. You can get a little bit creative if you want a brown base coat for your miniatures. Again, this is your creative process. If you want to change things up a little bit, this is entirely up to you. If you want to change some of the colours, and all the colours that I've just previously mentioned, you don't have to run out and buy those. 9 times out of 10, most of the colour ranges that are on the market at the moment will have a colour match, and you may already have these colours in your paint sets. It's just a case of going online and seeing which colours match up to which brand. At this point, we should have all our miniatures base coated out with the addition of the work that we've previously done on the skin, and this is the stage where we can now move on to adding some more of the special effects and really bringing this miniature to life. The first stage that we're going to add to the miniatures is a unifying wash of Villainy Ink Goons Grime. Now the reason I've chose Goons Grime is one, this is a unifying wash which is going to add some shadows to our miniature. It's going to pull everything together and tie it into its environment. But also Villainy Ink Goons Grime does have a very, very small, slight granular effect that is perfect for the texturing that I previously spoke about right at the beginning, and it's in scale and it works perfectly with the miniatures that we're trying to create. Also, because the colour of it, this is going to act as some like sweat or mucus build-up that's happened over time, and it's just going to add a little bit more to that gnarly, grotesque skin. I add some Goons Grime to my palette and thin it in a 1:1 ratio with mineral spirits, and then start to evenly apply it around the miniature. If you do get any build-up or pool areas, just simply go in and wick them away or spread it around the surrounding areas. Now give that around 15 to 20 minutes to dry. You can use a blow dry to speed up that process, and then we can come in with our removal phase. Now I'm going to do this removal pass and our reductive technique in 3 stages. So first of all, I'm going to get a cotton Q-tip or a sponge and just come in lightly moistened with mineral spirits to reactivate that Goons Grime, and just do a general cleanup first of all of the actual miniature, just removing it from the highlighted points and the points where I don't really want that to be, or I want some of the highlights on the certain areas, and leaving it into the shadows. Now once I've done that, the second part of that, I'm going to come in with an old clean brush, and this is just going to be very slightly moistened with mineral spirits. You don't want to overload it. And then I'm going to come in with some streaking motions and just moving my brush up and down, and this is going to help the Goons Grime that's still remaining on the miniature, and it's going to turn that into streaks as though it started to drip down their bodies. Now finally, if you've got any areas that you do need to clean up additionally, I like to do this, I call it more of a dissolve technique. So I get some mineral spirits onto my brush, a little bit more than what we'd previously added, and I just tap the area, and what that'll do is, because of the capillary reaction, it'll just push away that Goons Grime. If you do these close to each other, it almost creates like a scarred, mottled effect, and this again is just going to add to the overall effect of their skin. Last off, just give this around 15 to 20 minutes to dry before moving on to the next stages. Next up, we're going to add some more mottling and deepen some of those sword parts using Villainy Ink Carrying Crimson. Now this is going to do a couple of different things. One, it's going to darken those recesses, and also due to the nature of its properties, like that slight granular effects that I previously spoke about with the Goons Grime, Carrying Crimson has slightly larger pigments, which is perfect when we spread it around the miniature. You get that redder area, but then in that mix you also get these tiny little pigmented particles that will add even further mottling scabs and scars to the miniature that really is perfect for these types of skin effects. It will also dry satin to glossy, which is perfect again for creating that surface variation, the distinction between the crusted oily skin to the more mucus and wet effects of their skin. To do this, we've already got a guide to where to place this, and I'm only going to place it around some of the intestine areas and basically apply it to all the areas that we previously came in and added the red filters to the skin. So it's just a case of applying it to there in a 1-to-1 ratio, and there's not really a removal phase or anything like that for this. I just tend to let it dry and leave it as is. However, if you do need to come on and clean up any of those areas or push some of those little pigments about, you can do that as well. And sometimes you'll find that it mixes in a little bit with the Goons Grime, creating some more unique colours and variation. So for the next portion of this video, I want to talk about the UV resin technique. This technique has been utilized and has been around for quite some time, but I want to show you how we can implement this into the Grimdark style and Grimdark painting due to its unique properties. Now, although this technique does look very similar to the glue technique, it is different in its own right. The UV resin technique allows us to build up transparent layers that, once cured, take on a glossy surface. This finish naturally repels water-based paints, letting them glide effortlessly across the surface before they actually dry. That unique property gives us a chance to manipulate the paint into organic, unpredictable patterns, from delicate beading to branch and vein-like structures. You can also use this method to create otherworldly translucent forms, similar to the eerie glassy heads that are seen in the sci-fi horror Alien films. In contrast, the glue technique, though still glossy when dry, doesn't repel water-based paints in the same way that the UV resin technique does. With the glue technique, paint tends to stick more readily, offering a different kind of control and finish. Both methods have their strengths and each shines in different contexts, but by having both techniques in your creative toolbox, you'll be able to choose the one that best suits the effect that you're aiming for. Now, just a quick word of safety warning before we get into this technique. Just like our glue technique, you do need to be taking precautions when using this, so make sure you do have some gloves and a respirator, as these do have some toxic chemicals in, and make sure that you are in a well ventilated area. It is slightly safer than the glue technique, but we still need to be taking those precautions when using products like this. So first of all, I've loaded some of the UV resin onto my palette, and because of its thin nature, I'm just going to apply a very thin, even layer to the sack on the Hound and around his mouth. So I'm just going to apply one thin layer, and that's going to lock everything in. But unlike the glue technique, this technique does have a ton of working time. You've got so much working time with this, because essentially it doesn't dry or cure until you've hit it with the UV light. And we're going to do this and add as many or as multiple layers as you like. So once we've applied that first thin layer to the areas that we've desired, we're then going to come in with our UV torch and just apply it for around 2 to 3 minutes, or some cases if you're doing smaller areas it won't even take that long. It can be anything from 30 seconds to even a minute. You'll know it's dry when you touch it, it's just as hard as nails. But essentially what we're then going to do is come in with some washes or something, or even just some acrylic watered down paints. And I found that it has this very strange capillary reaction, and it almost like when you put it on, because of the capillary action, the paint dissolves outwards, or it doesn't quite apply perfectly to the miniature, which is perfect for what we're trying to create. So we can add just some dark mottled effects or some more blood effects to that. And then what we can do, you can even gum back in, because it's not dried yet due to that capillary action, with just some water, and start to manipulate it. If you want to turn it into some veins, you can do that as well. And again, this is where I've just started to experiment with the possibilities of this effect and how it works with the UV resin. But after I've added that first layer, I'm then going to come in with a second layer of the UV resin, apply that to it, cure it, go back in with some more mottling, maybe with some different colours or the same colours, apply another layer, and again you can apply as many layers as you want with this until you're happy with the final results. And then I just lock everything in with a final layer of UV resin, cure it, and then we are good to go. This UV technique can also be utilised in and around some of the other miniatures. It's not just limited to the sack, because it dries and it's going to look really glossy. I do apply some to the intestinal areas on some of the miniatures and also around some of the boils, and it'll almost appear and read as a wet effect. So this is really good if you want to make something look damp or wet. It's just a case of coming in with your UV torch and then curing it. But like I said, this is just something that I've just started to experiment with, and I know a lot of you will be going away and creating some amazing, crazy results using this technique. And if you do make any mistakes whilst applying UV resin, and before you've even cured it, if you do make any mistakes and you want to remove it from any areas, just simply come in with some isopropyl alcohol, and that'll just clean up all the UV resin from your miniature. But this will only work before the curing stage. Before moving on, I just want to quickly take a moment to say, if you are enjoying this video and you do want to know how I painted the rest of the characters, those tutorials will be available exclusively over at the Grimdark Compendium, including full coverage of all the other Trench Crusade factions. And right now we're running our summer sale, and this is a great time to pick up some Villainy Ink along with some additional course bundles at a discount. It's the best way to support us and what we're doing, and it just helps us keep bringing you more content like this. After all that stage has been completed and dried, I then came in with some Ichor of the Damned from Villainy Inks and just darkened up some areas, added some contrast to some additional areas such as the intestines, and overall add some contrast to the miniature. Now, I also got the Ichor of the Damned and turned some of these into streaks, like some pores and sores coming out, and you can even add some blood effects to this if you want, as though some blood started to leak out, especially on the Hound, as you know, it's drinking the blood of other people. If it's got holes in it or anything, it's going to start to seep out of there as well. Finally, the last steps I added to the flesh were again some final filters, especially on the Hound. It was leaning more into the red side of paint, with the red side of the colour palette, which I didn't really want. I wanted to add a little bit of coldness and push it into a grey. So for this I just loaded up some Collier green in my airbrush and just very lightly spritzed it into some of the shadow areas. And whilst I got the Collier green out, you can come in with a very thin brush and just start to apply some very thin transparent lines and veins around your miniature. We will later on in the additional episodes get into how you can manipulate and create these even more, but for now it's just a case of getting a thin brush and applying some of those transparent Collier green veins or any other colour that you desire to the miniatures. And because they are transparent, these will also appear sat underneath the skin. You will notice as well I've not added any additional highlights to the skin sections, and this is for multiple reasons. One, because we've applied that really bright base coat first of all for the skin with a deck tan. That's going to lead, once we've knocked it back a bit with the layers and techniques that we've just added, it'll still remain highlighted. And if we've applied all the other stages correctly, then we've got no need for any additional highlights. However, if you do find that you do need to add some additional highlights to the miniatures, I loaded up some Abtalon 502's dust and just very lightly, not like the oil scrubbing technique, we don't need to be that precise with offloading our brush, but I've not loaded it too heavily, but I've just come in very lightly with some dry brushing to add some additional highlights. And the reason for the oil paints is that if we do need to buff or blend these out just to smooth out some of those transitions, we can easily achieve that with the oil paints. Whilst we're on the subject of oils, I'm then going to move on to the fabric areas and do a little bit of oil dot filtering. This is just adding some oil dots around the miniature, just sporadically, just dot them here and there, and then grab a dry, clean brush, just lightly moistened again with mineral spirits, and in a buffing or a swooshing motion up and down, just start to work this into the actual fabric sections themselves. Now, because we've added a couple of different colours of oil paint, this is going to add some additional mottling and colour variation to the fabric itself. Once that has dried, I've then got some Abtalon 502 smoke, added a little bit of the dust to that in a 50-50 mix, and again very lightly. It's important that you don't overload the brush. Remove about 99% of the pigment off your brush and then start to apply it just very roughly, dry brushing this onto the highlight sections of the cape. Now, because oils are very forgiving and we don't need to do multiple glazes or blending or anything like that with these, we can just come in with a clean dry brush, no mineral spirits this time, and just start to work and buff those areas and those transitions from the highlights to smooth everything out. Once those oil paints had dried, this will now allow me to come in with a sharp tool such as an airbrush needle, a paperclip, or any sort of tool that you may have that's quite sharp lying around, and then I can come in and do a little bit of soft pressing. And because we've got that oil layer on and it's not fully cured, we can then scratch through it, and this will create a very microscopic indentation around that fabric, and it'll just help with the wear and tear and make everything look a little bit more realistic and giving the separation away from the skin, and it'll look like its own separate piece of fabric. But due to that oil paint being as it is, that just allows us to scratch through it, and I do around 2 or 3 very small passes, and pressure is key here. You don't want to be scratching through your acrylic layers or anything like that. So I just literally use the weight of the tool, so I hold it right at the back end and I just allow the weight of the tool to do the actual pressure and the scratch itself. Just remember at the end of this, again, to grab an old brush, a dry brush, and just clean up any debris or any little bits that may be lying around the miniature, just to dust those particles off. At this point, for the rust or the metallic areas, I'm just going to give everything a wash of Villainy Ink Sector Rust, and I've applied this to the chainmail, the sword, and any other metallic areas. And once dry, that'll dry really matte and chalky, and then if you want to do a removal pass, you can. I didn't do it on this one exactly because I wanted mine to have a really heavy, rusted, corroded texture. But I also applied some around some boils. Because we've got that nice red and cold skin, you can warm things up a little bit more and also get some more surface finish variation around some of the boils or some corroded sections of your skin. And because that'll dry really matte and chalky, it'll contrast nicely against those wet UV effects and the Ichor of the Damned, which will dry a little bit more satin. So you've got a ton of variation going off around your miniature and even on the skin. Next up, I wanted to create some dust and just some weathering around the lower half of the miniature, and for this I've used Villainy Ink Phase 2 All Is Dust, and using a spattering motion with my brush, I've just applied it to it, hit it with an hairdryer so that it dries extra chalky, and if you need to buff or remove any parts of that out, it comes off very easy before it actually cures, so you can just get a brush and just blend or smooth these in to get that dusty appearance. But I do leave some of those splats just splattered around the miniature as I've been walking along the battlefield, and some of this muck and dirt's kicked up onto the lower half of the miniature. If you don't have Villainy Ink's Phase 2, you could just simply water down some of the Abtalon 502's dust into more of a wash and get a similar result for this effect. To create the subtle verdigris effect on the armour, I've used two paints for this, and I've used Villainy Ink's Colia Green and Villainy Ink Decay of Death. Now, Colia Green typically does dry a little bit more on the satin side, but what I'm going to do, first of all, for that, I thin Villainy Ink Colia Green with Mineral Spirits in a 2:1 ratio, so that's going to dry a little bit more satin to matte. And then because it's, when I've applied it to the armour sections, because we've got that Villainy Ink's Goons Grime on there already, it's going to combine and mix with that and dry even more on the matte side. However, if some areas are drying a little bit satin, there's no need to worry, because this second, which if you want to call it a highlight, but it's not, it's just the lighter colours of the verdigris, I'm going to come in with Villainy Ink Decay of Death and apply that to those areas, and because that dries really chalky, it's going to blend with that Colia Green and push it more into that matte and chalky finish, and it's perfect for any of your verdigris effects. And to finish off these miniatures, I'm just going to come in with Dirty Downs Rust for the metallic or rusted areas. Now, to have some tips around Dirty Downs Rust, I make sure that it is a little bit warm. So what I tend to do when I know I'm about 10-15 minutes away from using it, I get the bottle out, I put it in my pocket so that it's getting the heat off my body, which is going to start to warm it up. I then open it up, get like a rod, and make sure all that sediment on the bottom is not stuck to the bottom, and then I give it a really good shake. And now with the Dirty Downs Rust, depending if you had it neatly, it's going to apply and dry a lot darker, but then you can come in with some water to manipulate it and reactivate it, and this will just turn it into a lighter rust tone colour. And just from this one product you can get a ton of different variation around your miniatures. So let's just do a quick overview and a recap of what's just happened. So I know I've spoke a lot in this video and it might seem like there's a lot of processes and a lot of information, but ultimately we've not actually done that much to the miniatures. Just from some simple like base coat highlights and base coats, and adding some special effects to them using the enamels and some additional products, we've been able to create a lifelike and realistic miniature that's in scale, and it's got a ton of variation of surface finish variation. It's got a ton of texture from the pre-texture that we added, and then also the texture from the Villainy Inks themselves. But with these small steps, you've got a miniature that's true to its Grimdark origins and is realistic and lifelike looking. So I'd like to thank you for spending your time here with me in this episode, and I can't wait for you to join me in episode 2 and the rest of the course. But until next time guys, I've been Nate the Feral Painter, and I will catch you in the next episode.